Hollywood often markets its action films as perfect, premeditated masterpieces, yet the truth behind the camera tells a very different story. Some of the most celebrated action movies ever made were only a few revisions away from a complete reversal where the villain could have become the central hero, changing the entire trajectory of the film. Early drafts, casting notes, and unseen production discussions reveal that key characters were almost recast, storylines nearly rewritten, and entire arcs shifted based on fear politics or the whims of powerful studio executives. These hidden choices illustrate how fragile and malleable cinematic history really is, and how a single creative decision can rewrite the perception of heroism and villainy on screen. Tonight, we explore 15 iconic action films where the roles of villain and hero were dangerously close to being swapped, exposing the untold versions of movies we thought we knew. These are the stories buried behind closed doors in scripts that never made it to the cutting room floor and in casting decisions that would have altered the entire genre. What you are about to see is not the public version, but the shadowy history of these films, a glimpse into what might have been if the studio's hand had faltered, if an actor had chosen differently, or if a writer's vision had gone unchecked. This journey behind the velvet curtain will reveal just how thin the line between hero and villain can be, and why the movies you know today could easily have told a very different story. Every decision, every edit, and every casting choice mattered. And in the hands of someone else, these films might have become tales with heroes who were villains and villains who were champions. The alternate realities of these 15 films await you, each hiding secrets that were almost made public, but were quietly suppressed to preserve the narrative Hollywood thought audiences wanted. Prepare to witness the hidden history, the almost changes, and the creative gambles that shaped cinematic legends. Fact 1: Terminator 1984. Before The Terminator became the defining sci-fi action film of the 1980, the early concept was very different. Arnold Schwarzenegger was originally considered for Kyle Reese, the heroic soldier sent back to protect Sarah Connor, while the Terminator itself was envisioned as a seemingly ordinary human figure, almost invisible among people. In those initial drafts, the narrative leaned toward Reese's bravery, and the villain's presence was understated, emphasizing a subtle, almost psychological menace rather than the unstoppable cyborg we know today. Behind closed doors, studio executives debated whether Arnold's imposing physique and unique screen presence would make him relatable, as a hero fearing audiences might struggle to empathize with such a dominating figure. When James Cameron watched Schwarzenegger demonstrate the physicality and precision that he could bring to the Terminator, everything shifted. The director recognized that Arnold embodied the relentless machine better than anyone could, and the villain role solidified around him. This one decision reshaped the franchise, establishing the iconic figure of the Terminator while pushing Kyle Reese into a supporting yet pivotal role. Had things gone differently, audiences might have seen a very different Arnold, a fragile, desperate hero, and a subtle, almost humanized Terminator lurking in the shadows. The shift exemplifies how a single meeting, a single insight into an actor's abilities can entirely transform a story. The early drafts and casting notes reveal a hidden history where the hero and villain roles were dangerously close to being reversed, a cinematic alternate reality that exists only in archival documents and production memories. The Terminator, as we know it, emerged from that delicate balancing act, cementing Arnold's status as the ultimate action villain of the decade. Fact 2: Die Hard 1988. When Die Hard was first drafted, Hans Gruber's character carried far more narrative weight than John McClane. Early scripts explored Gruber's sophistication and intellect, portraying him almost as an anti-hero with a sympathetic perspective, highlighting motivations that were morally complex rather than purely criminal. The initial concept included extended scenes that developed his reasoning, charisma, and strategic thinking, potentially eclipsing McClane's everyman charm. Studio executives reviewed these early readings with concern, realizing that Rickman's performance could dominate the film, making Gruber the figure audiences might root for instead of the protagonist. To counter this, rewrites emphasized McClane's relatability, amplified his humor, and simplified Gruber's motivations to align more closely with traditional villainy. While Rickman's portrayal remains iconic, the original drafts suggest a film where Gruber's intelligence and moral ambiguity could have made him the narrative's central force. This behind-the-scenes tension highlights Hollywood's careful manipulation of audience sympathy, showing how casting, script adjustments, and subtle narrative reshaping ensured that the hero-villain balance favored the protagonist despite the villain's compelling depth. The near reversal between hero and antagonist is an example of how small production decisions can alter a story's emotional focus, preserving McClane as the audience's anchor while relegating Gruber to his role as an unforgettable but contained adversary. The alternate vision, Lost to History, offers a tantalizing glimpse into a version of Die Hard where the lines between heroism and villainy far less clear. Fact 3. The Dark Knight 2008. The earliest drafts of The Dark Knight positioned the Joker at the heart of the narrative, with his philosophy, schemes, and actions shaping the story's moral landscape. Batman was conceptualized more as a reactive figure, a symbol against which the Joker's chaotic vision could be measured. These scripts emphasized Joker's cunning and psychological manipulation, with extensive sequences designed to explore his ideology and reasoning, elevating him almost to the level of protagonist. Studio executives grew concerned that the character's magnetic presence, especially once Heath Ledger's intense interpretation was anticipated, could overshadow Batman and unbalance the film. Revisions were mandated to redistribute narrative weight, trim Joker-centric passages, and enhance scenes, focusing on Bruce Wayne's internal conflict and moral decisions. Ledger's performance still dominates on screen, but the final cut ensured that Batman remained the story's focal point, with Joker as the disruptive force rather than its central narrator. This creative tension underscores the delicate act of balancing character prominence in blockbuster filmmaking, illustrating how narrative casting and performance converge to direct audience empathy. The early scripts reveal a world where the Joker almost reigned as the moral and narrative center, a hidden path suppressed in the final, celebrated version of the film. Fact 4. Face/Off 1997. During the early development of Face/Off, the film's central casting was far from final. John Travolta and Nicolas Cage were initially considered for opposite roles, with Cage as the FBI agent Sean Archer and Travolta as the terrorist Castor Troy. The original drafts envisioned Archer as a disciplined, morally centered protagonist, while Troy's villainy was tempered by charisma and intelligence. Early costume tests reflected this arrangement, portraying Travolta in the elaborate attire of Troy and Cage in Archer's tactical gear. However, both actors expressed interest in swapping roles to explore the narrative from the other perspective. Director John Woo recognized the potential for enhanced dramatic tension and agreed to reverse the parts. This pivotal decision reshaped the film's dynamic, creating a unique high-stakes duel between two actors portraying each other's identities. The rewritten narrative heightened psychological complexity, amplified suspense, and contributed to the film's enduring legacy. Original drafts reveal a version where audience empathy might have been aligned differently with the villain or hero, eliciting unexpected sympathy. The near swap illustrates how casting flexibility, actor input, and director vision can profoundly influence narrative structure. It also demonstrates how Hollywood's creative process can pivot on personal interpretation, studio discussion, and strategic adjustments to character prominence. Without the final casting switch, face/off could have presented a fundamentally different audience experience, emphasizing traits and tensions now lost in production history. Fact 5. Speed, 1994. Speed initially explored Howard Payne's character in a more psychologically nuanced direction. Early drafts portrayed him as a former bomb squad officer, emotionally scarred by past failures and motivated by a desire for recognition, not merely by greed or malice. Scenes described his elaborate traps as symbolic acts of frustration against a system that disregarded his expertise. Jack Traven, meanwhile, appeared more secondary, reacting to the unfolding situation rather than driving the narrative. Test readings and studio evaluations raised concerns that audiences might sympathize with Payne instead of the hero. Executives requested rewrites to simplify motivations, emphasize threat and villainy, and enhance Traven's heroic qualities, including his intelligence, quick thinking, and moral clarity. Dialogue adjustments, scene restructuring, and tension pacing ensured that viewers aligned with the protagonist while perceiving the antagonist as a dangerous yet clearly defined foe. These changes not only secured audience engagement, but also preserved the high-octane momentum essential to the film's success. The early conceptualizations, now largely unseen, suggest a narrative where moral ambiguity could have complicated audience perception, offering a very different tone and emotional focus. The transformation highlights the delicate balance between character empathy, audience perception, and studio preferences in shaping an action thriller. Fact 6. RoboCop 1987. In the early drafts of RoboCop, Dick Jones, the corporate executive, was originally envisioned as the central character navigating a crumbling Detroit while implementing advanced law enforcement strategies. Alex Murphy existed as a supporting figure, his human struggles secondary to Jones's calculated decisions and influence. The scripts portrayed Jones as a complex, morally ambiguous figure balancing corporate ambition with a desire to stabilize the city. Studio concerns over audience connection prompted a significant narrative shift. Murphy was elevated to protagonist embodying humanity, vulnerability, and the moral center of the story. Jones's role was redefined as a clear antagonist, emphasizing corporate greed and ruthlessness. This reorientation involved rewriting dialogue, restructuring scenes, and adjusting character focus to align audience sympathy with Murphy. The early drafts preserved in production notes reveal a very different narrative architecture, one where a corporate leader with layered motivations guided the story, challenging conventional hero-villain dichotomies. The final film, while celebrated for its social commentary and iconic protagonist, conceals an almost entirely different conceptual foundation, illustrating the extent to which studio intervention, narrative recalibration, and audience perception shape cinematic storytelling. Fact 7. Lethal Weapon 1987. In the earliest drafts of Lethal Weapon, Martin Riggs was portrayed as a highly unstable, almost threatening figure whose grief and combat skills made him more dangerous than the criminals he pursued. His volatility created tension not only in the story, but also for the audience's perception of morality making it uncertain whether he could be considered a traditional hero. Studio executives feared that audiences might struggle to empathize with a protagonist who could so easily become violent and unhinged. Rewrites gradually softened Riggs, emphasizing his vulnerability, humor, and heroic instincts while maintaining the edge that made him compelling. His relationship with Roger Murtaugh was expanded to serve as an emotional anchor balancing Riggs' unpredictability. The final script transformed him into the damaged but relatable hero audiences adore, while preserving elements of his original tension to heighten drama. These adjustments demonstrate how studio input, character development, and narrative tone converge to create a balanced protagonist. Early drafts depict a far darker, morally ambiguous Riggs, who could have easily become a cautionary figure rather than a celebrated hero, highlighting the delicate interplay between character writing and audience alignment. Fact 8. X-Men 2000. Before X-Men became a blockbuster centered around Wolverine and Professor Xavier, Magneto was intended to serve as the narrative's protagonist. Early scripts explored his history, ideology, and motivations in depth, emphasizing the moral and political complexity of his struggle against human oppression. Wolverine's role was secondary, and the story examined Magneto's perspective as a tragic revolutionary attempting to protect mutant kind. Studio executives grew concerned that a narrative driven by a villainous character, even a sympathetic one, would alienate mainstream audiences and reduce marketability. Consequently, the focus shifted to Wolverine, with Magneto repositioned as the antagonist opposing the hero. Scenes exploring Magneto's past and internal conflict were trimmed, and the story was restructured to align audience sympathy with the hero's journey. These creative decisions highlight how Hollywood balances character prominence, audience expectation, and narrative clarity. While the final film celebrates Wolverine as the central figure, archival drafts reveal a version where Magneto's perspective almost redefined the story, providing insight into the intricate decisions that shape blockbuster storytelling and character alignment in superhero cinema. Fact 9. Predator 1987. Early treatments of Predator depicted Dutch as a ruthless, highly efficient mercenary whose methods mirrored the predatory instincts of the alien antagonist. The Predator itself was conceived as a creature acting primarily in self-defense, with its hunting behavior contextualized as a response to human intrusion rather than malevolence. The film initially explored the moral ambiguity of both hunter and hunted, challenging audiences to consider Dutch's violence and decision-making as ethically complex. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was cast, the studio insisted on recasting Dutch as a clear hero, emphasizing courage, integrity, and loyalty, while portraying the Predator as the primary threat. Script rewrites and scene adjustments reinforced Dutch's moral center and ensured audience alignment, with his actions creating the familiar hero versus monster dynamic. These early drafts illustrate a film where heroism and villainy were far more blurred, demonstrating the impact of casting decisions and studio intervention on narrative perception. The final movie presents an iconic hero in Dutch and a terrifying Predator, but archival notes reveal the near reversal of roles that could have dramatically altered the story's ethical and emotional framework. Fact 10. Skyfall 2012. During the initial drafts of Skyfall, Silva was conceived as a former MI6 operative who returned not to seek revenge, but to assist Bond and protect M from internal corruption. The early storyline framed Silva as a morally ambiguous ally, someone whose personal grievances were intertwined with a desire to safeguard the agency. His interactions with Bond emphasized strategy, cooperation, and the complexity of navigating loyalty and betrayal within the intelligence community. Studio executives, however, grew concerned that presenting Silva in a sympathetic or heroic light might confuse audiences or reduce the impact of his eventual villainous turn. Rewrites reframed Silva as an antagonist, emphasizing revenge, obsession, and psychological manipulation to enhance narrative tension. Scenes illustrating his potential heroism were reduced or removed entirely, and Bond's perspective was emphasized as the story's moral anchor. This adjustment created the iconic struggle between hero and villain that audiences experienced while obscuring the earlier conception of Silva as a conflicted ally. The behind-the-scenes documents and early scripts reveal a story almost told from the perspective of the man who would ultimately become the film's most formidable adversary, demonstrating the influence of studio oversight on character alignment and audience perception. Fact 11, First Blood, 1982. In the original drafts of First Blood, John Rambo was not the sympathetic protagonist we now recognize. Instead, he was depicted as a dangerous, unpredictable ex-soldier whose combat skills and psychological instability posed significant threats to the town he encountered. Sheriff Teasel was initially the central figure embodying authority and narrative focus while managing the chaos caused by Rambo. Early scripts highlighted Rambo's capacity for extreme violence in sequences, depicted confrontations that emphasized the character's lethal potential. When Sylvester Stallone joined the project, he advocated for changes to humanize Rambo, shifting him from a menacing figure into a tragic hero whose actions were reactions to systemic injustice and personal trauma. Rewrites softened his behavior, created a moral framework that aligned audiences with him, and restructured the narrative to place him at the story's center. These changes transformed First Blood into a critique of institutional neglect and the struggles of returning veterans. Archival drafts illustrate an alternate conception in which Rambo's role as a threat rather than a hero dominated the story, revealing how casting choices and actor input can drastically alter audience perception and thematic focus. Fact 12, The Bourne Identity, 2002. The early iterations of the Bourne Identity framed Treadstone, the covert government program, as a force of heroism tasked with controlling a rogue operative whose actions threatened global stability. Jason Bourne was portrayed primarily as an unpredictable, potentially dangerous figure, with amnesia compounding his threat. The narrative was structured around the agency's perspective, highlighting its efforts to neutralize the escaped operative. Upon casting Matt Damon and emphasizing audience empathy, the story was reshaped to position Bourne as the protagonist and Treadstone as the morally ambiguous antagonist. Dialogue, scene emphasis, and narrative focus were altered to highlight Bourne's struggle for identity and survival, while the agency's operations were framed as oppressive rather than protective. These revisions allowed audiences to identify with Bourne's plight while maintaining tension with a powerful adversary. Early drafts, now mostly unseen, reveal a narrative inversion in which the hero and villain roles were nearly reversed, offering insight into how casting perspective and studio guidance can redefine narrative alignment, ethical interpretation, and viewer engagement in a high-stakes espionage thriller. Fact 13, Batman, 1989. Before Tim Burton's Batman reached theaters, early development discussions included the radical idea of placing the Joker at the story's center, elevating him from antagonist to primary narrative driver. The scripts explored his background, philosophy, and chaotic worldview in depth, envisioning him as a character whose actions and perspective guided the audience's understanding of Gotham. Michael Keaton was even considered for the role of Joker in early concept deliberations, highlighting how the studio experimented with unconventional casting to emphasize character intrigue. Burton intervened to preserve Batman's position as the central hero, recasting the Joker with Jack Nicholson, and restructuring scenes to ensure narrative focus remained on Bruce Wayne. Dialogue and visual emphasis were adjusted, balancing Batman's moral authority against the Joker's menace. The final film emphasizes the conflict between hero and villain, but archival materials reveal a near inversion in character prominence, demonstrating how casting, directorial oversight, and studio influence can determine which perspective dominates the narrative, shaping audience perception and sustaining iconic status. Fact 14. The Rock 1996. The initial conception of The Rock presented General Francis Hummel as the protagonist, a heroic figure driven by loyalty to his fallen soldiers and disillusionment with the government that failed them. Early scripts highlighted his strategic intelligence, ethical code, and complex motivations, framing the narrative around his moral struggle rather than positioning him as an adversary. Studio concerns over audience reception and potential political sensitivities prompted substantial rewrites, transforming Hummel into the film's primary antagonist while maintaining traces of his original dignity and purpose. Ed Harris's performance retained these nuances, creating a layered villain whose underlying principles were still perceptible. Narrative emphasis shifted toward the hero's perspective, reinforcing traditional audience alignment and ensuring clarity between protagonist and antagonist. The original drafts illustrate a version in which Hummel's moral and narrative authority could have led audiences to view him as the central hero, providing insight into how studio intervention and story restructuring shape character alignment, ethical interpretation, and the emotional impact of an action film. Fact 15. Con Air 1997. Early drafts of Con Air depicted Cameron Poe as a highly dangerous convict central to the narrative's tension and moral ambiguity. The story initially positioned Poe not as a traditional hero, but as a figure whose intelligent survival instincts and moral flexibility created complex interactions with other convicts, particularly Cyrus the Virus. Studio intervention mandated rewrites that reframed Poe as a noble protagonist, seeking to reunite with his family, simplifying motivations, and emphasizing heroism, while Cyrus's role was amplified as the primary villain. Adjustments to dialogue, scene sequencing, and character focus ensured audience alignment with Poe and clarified narrative stakes. The final film celebrates Poe as the courageous hero navigating extraordinary circumstances, yet archival materials reveal an earlier conception in which moral polarity was blurred, demonstrating how casting, studio guidance, and script revisions can fundamentally alter character perception and audience empathy in high-stakes action narratives. Bonus fact: the action classic that hid its true villain until the final cut. One of the most celebrated action films in cinematic history almost told its story from the villain's perspective. During pre-production, the filmmakers explored a version where the antagonist's motivations, plans, and moral rationale were central, effectively making him the character audiences were meant to empathize with. Scenes were shot highlighting his strategic intelligence, emotional depth, and personal struggle, while the hero's role was deliberately secondary, reacting to the villain's calculated actions. Studio executives reviewed early cuts and expressed concern that audiences might find themselves rooting for the antagonist, potentially undermining the traditional hero versus villain dynamic. In response, the production team undertook significant alteration. Scenes emphasizing the villain's humanity were removed or minimized, dialogue was rewritten to clarify intentions, and camera angles were adjusted to recenter the narrative on the hero. Post-production editing reinforced the hero's moral authority while containing the villain's appeal. Today, audiences only see the finalized version in which the hero prevails and the antagonist serves as the obstacle. However, archived scripts, storyboards, and internal notes reveal the hidden reality of the creative process, exposing a time when the villain nearly became the story's emotional and narrative anchor. This concealed iteration demonstrates the delicate balance between audience expectation, studio oversight, and narrative clarity. It also serves as a reminder that the most iconic films might have existed in entirely different forms, quietly suppressed to maintain the moral and emotional alignment required for mainstream success. The shadows of this nearly told story remain preserved in the unseen archives, offering a tantalizing glimpse of what could have been. Now that you've seen how fragile the line between hero and villain can be, remember that Hollywood's most iconic action films were shaped by countless unseen decisions. Every casting choice, script rewrite, and editorial change influenced the story, determining which character audiences would empathize with. Behind every celebrated hero lies a shadow of what might have been a villain, almost elevated, a plot nearly inverted. Stay tuned to uncover more hidden truths, secret drafts, and the behind-the-scenes machinations that studio executives never wanted you to see. The next revelations await, ready to expose the untold stories behind your favorite films.